Let's now move on to the next process, which is called define scope. The project scope drives the execution of the project, and here the project manager refines the requirements that were previously collected. So you can see that our requirements documentation we talked about previously will now need to be added and tuned and refined. This process, of course, is within the scope management knowledge area and falls under the planning process group. Let's have a look at the inputs. The scope management plan, of course, lays out exactly how all of the scope activities will be managed, including this one. The requirements documentation, these of course have all emanated from the stakeholders, and this is the main input we use here in order to define the scope, as it lays down exactly what requirements the project has to embed and the degree to which each requirement must perform. The project charter contains a detailed overview of the scope itself, along with the goals, constraints and assumptions. Organisational process assets, there may be some templates or procedures that will help in the definition of scope. There are two main outputs here. The project scope statement, which has been refined from the previous process after additional analysis. It will almost certainly include some changes and now lists the requirements in full detail. It should also include the criteria for accepting the end product. Project document updates. As a result of the work we've done already, you may update the stakeholder register, for example, some or many parts of the requirements documentation, and also the requirements traceability matrix. Almost certainly, as in refining the requirements, this will have been updated. You may have had new people or extra information added to each requirement. As for tools, we're going to cover product analysis in the next slide. Just talking briefly about alternatives generation. This is to encourage the team to consider all options relating to the project scope. And the use of brainstorming is quite a good way of doing this. Expert judgment. This will normally use technical experts as we take the requirements and translate it into the project scope statement. Facilitated workshops with key stakeholders invited, of course, are an excellent way of developing better understanding about the detail within each requirement. Let's quickly go over those tools now in a little bit more detail, but first remind ourselves that what we're doing here is analysing the project's product, service or result. And this tool should be used to improve the team's understanding and then to capture as requirements. The first tool is called a product breakdown structure. As it's called product breakdown, it's actually a product breakdown structure. And here it looks a little like a work breakdown structure, but each of these boxes are products as you break it down into lower and lower level detail. Imagine, if you will, a family car being split into the chassis, the body, the engine, the gearbox, the brakes, and so on and so forth, and gradually coming right down to the lowest level detail where you're talking about the inner tube of a tyre, for example. Value analysis, a systematic effort to improve upon cost and or performance of products and services, either purchased or produced. What it actually does is examine the materials, processes, information systems and the flow of materials involved. You've probably heard of value analysis before. It's used a lot in manufacturing as an example. In a similar way, value engineering, a technique in which the value of a system's outputs are optimized by creating a mix of performance, function and costs. Don't worry, you won't need to describe these in any more detail than I've got here. You certainly don't need to know much more than that, as these tend to be fairly specialist areas. Value engineering identifies and removes unnecessary expenditures, thereby increasing the value for the manufacturer and or their customers. Organisations I've worked for in the past have actually had experts at running workshops using these two techniques. Systems engineering, designed and managed, including coordination of different teams, automatic control of machinery, work processes and tools, covering both the technical or product aspects and also human-centred disciplines. In other words, how the work is carried out by humans. Requirements analysis. What we're trying to do here is to tie back requirements, determining the needs or conditions to meet for a new or altered product, taking account of possible conflicting requirements from the various stakeholders. Again, it's to try and attempt to get a consensus. Systems analysis, the process of investigating a system identifying problems and using the information to recommend improvements to the system. Very similar here to systems engineering and value analysis. Okay, that's about all we need to cover here. Let's move on and look at the very important project scope statement. Remember, this describes the scope of the project in detail and serves as a common understanding of project scope among the stakeholders. Also, of course, serves as a reference for future project decisions, so it's very important. Here's the information that you'd expect to find in the project scope statement. First of all, the main project objectives and goals, if you will. The product scope description. It's a description of the end product, if you will. The project deliverables, the main products that come out of it, that make up the end product. The project requirements, or a reference to other documentation. The boundaries, that's the scope in effect, isn't it? What's included and what isn't. It's very helpful to clarify the boundaries, to make it absolutely clear what we will not be doing as opposed to what we are doing. The acceptance criteria for each product and any constraints and assumptions we're making. It's important to capture assumptions so they can be tested later as the project progresses. The initial project organisation with roles and responsibilities, initial set of defined risks known at this point, schedule milestones. We will not have done any detailed planning yet at this point, so this type of information could be obtained from the project charter. Fund limitations, either in terms of the amount or timing. Cost estimates, this will be very high level at this early stage. And the configuration management requirements for the project. It's highly likely that you'll have a project office that will provide these services, and this will explain how you will work with them. Project specifications and who's responsible for approving each and all requirements. This then is the project scope statement.